Hi guys, put your phones down and listen. Right, we're going to go on a walk.
Do we have to? Please.
Look, you've not been out for a while. It'd be really good, and there is something amazing at the end of it. It's amazing. Come on, you'll be glad you did. Come on, it's amazing. Worth it! Keep going, come on!
Longer. This is stupid. It's been like 2 minutes already.
My shoes are all muddy.
It'll be great when we get there. Just keep going, it'll be worth it. It'll be amazing. There you go, look at that, it's amazing.
Dad, I don't like colour things.
We've been doing a Bible overview in these children's talks, and let me catch you up on where we've been so far. In the beginning, God created everything. He's the ruler of the universe, and everything is totally perfect. But then, all too quickly, in the 3rd chapter of the Bible, we find out about how Adam and Eve, the first man and the first woman, disobey God. They reject God's rule, and the perfect place is spoiled. But then there's hope. God makes promises to a man called Abraham. He says to Abraham that he's going to have a great many children. They're going to have a special land to live in, and they're going to live under God's rule. And through them, the whole world will one day be blessed. But it's not all plain sailing. Eventually they get a king. First King Saul, then King David, and then King Solomon. And things were okay, but as we saw last week, Solomon disobeyed God. He didn't listen to God. He was distracted from God, and he followed after idols. And sadly, that's how God's people carry on going. They keep on rejecting God's rule. They ignore him more and more and more until eventually God has enough, and he kicks them out of the promised land. They're taken into exile. Exile means when people have to live away from their home. And that's what God's people had to do. They were exiles in a place called Babylon. Now, if you know any Bible stories, you're probably familiar with Daniel and the lion's den. Those stories happened in this period of time. But think about God's people. They'd been made these amazing promises. But here they were in exile. Was it that God's promises would never come true? Would they never really be God's people in God's place under God's good rule? Well, before the time they went into exile, and even during the exile, God sent his prophets. Prophets are God's messengers, and they would go with God's message to his people. One of those prophets was someone called Jeremiah. Here's some of the most famous words from the book of Jeremiah in the Old Testament. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity. See, even though God's people have rejected him so much that they've been kicked out of the special place, actually God still loves them. God still has a plan for them, and he says through Jeremiah, look, I'm going to bring you back, and when you seek me, you'll find me. You'll get to live as my people under my rule again. Exile wasn't easy for God's people. It was 70 long, long years of living away from their homeland. And you can imagine that some people, well, maybe they stopped trusting in God's promise. But think about the sketch. Tim had told the kids that at the end of the walk was something absolutely amazing. And what did they find? Well, they found a bush with ice creams hung from it. If only those grew in the real world. But God's promise is far better than just some ice creams and some shrubbery. God had promised his people that if they turned back to him, he would call them back to himself and all of his promises would come true. They needed to keep trusting in the promise even when it seemed so difficult. Even when they felt like they couldn't go on. Because, and this is really important, God always keeps his promises. So as we read our Bibles then, we should remember this really sad period of God's people's history. But we should remember how, even in these times, even when God's people had turned their backs on him, God did not turn his back on them. He continued to love them. And the amazing thing is, God loves us in the same way. Even though we get things wrong and we keep on turning our backs on him, even though we act like he doesn't exist so often, he continues to love us. Turn back to God was one of the big messages that God had given his people through the prophets. And we're going to sing a song now, the chorus of which is Turn Back to God, the one and only Lord. Try and join in with the actions too.